Hello, demons and dead men. My name is TBSKyan, and as another finger curls on the monkey's paw, Riot have once again given me exactly what I want, but they've given me so much of it that it's difficult to make goddamn content about it, because what we have here is Kin of the Stained Blade, which is a short that was released like a couple of hours ago. I've been watching it a bunch of times to get a feel for it, with Yone and Yasuo. And some of it looks like this. It's just lovely 2D animation, really nice, animated on ones. We'll talk about that later. And then some of it looks like this, which is 3D animation. And it's got like 4 different studios that worked on it, and it's 10 minutes long, and it has an epilogue that sets up stuff that's probably going to be happening in the Riot Forge games that are coming out right now. And it provides like a capstone to one chapter in Yasuo's life, and it sort of reintroduces the concept of Yone and what he's going to be as a cousin. So much! Too much! Riot, why? Why did you... I mean, I asked for this. I quite literally asked for this. I've asked for it dozens and dozens of times, and now you've given it to me, and it's too much! Too much! Consequently, this is not going to be just one video. There's 10 minutes of animation here, and if you follow my channel, you know that I can turn 1 minute of animation into like half an hour of talking. So we will do this in 2 installments. We'll do the first half of the video now, and then the second half of the video in the next video. And I'm not gonna pretend like that's not also because I don't, like, yes, I want the extra views and stuff, because this is kind of a lot of work that I'm gonna have to do here. But it's also because I want to be able to take a break just for a sec, because I record these videos pretty much in one go when I record them, and then I edit them afterwards, obviously, but boy howdy, I'm gonna need a cup of tea or something in the middle of all of this. Anyway, Kin of the Stained Blade. It was directed by Howlin of Howliner's Animation. It was also worked on by Paper Plane Animation Studio, Ideo Motor, Studio Tumble, and CMC Media, with music by Brian D. Oliveira and sound design by Hexani Audio. This is kind of a big production, and probably outside of something like Arcane, the biggest animation production that Riot have done yet for stuff that is essentially like a champion teaser or a skin trailer, which is, at least in part is, because it's part of the whole Spirit Blossom thing. So this is like a pretty ambitious piece of production on Riot's part, which presumably has been in the works for quite a long time, for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that they frickin' animated this stuff on ones. We'll talk about that in a second. So, the first thing I want to impress upon you about this thing, like, we've seen Riot mix media before, like we've seen them mix between 2D and 3D in the Star Guardian short that came out with Star Guardian Nico, for example. It's something that they've dabbled in multiple times before, of using both styles interchangeably, which is becoming more and more of a like, if you watch mainstream anime nowadays, usually crowd scenes will be done in CG, and you'll have these awkward, stilted 3D character models kind of waddling around in the background, looking weird and strange. But it's a highly ambitious implementation of it here for League of Legends, because my assumption here is that 1 or 2 studios will have worked on the 2D animation, and then some of the other studios that are involved with this production will have worked on the 3D animation, and coordinating that kind of production across multiple studios, like when presumably you have like one main animation director, maybe some assistant directors, God only knows how long the credits list for this damn thing is. It's an ambitious production. It's a really difficult thing to coordinate. It's something like the reason why you don't see something of this level of ambition for Riot a lot is because it requires them to coordinate with multiple production partners, probably across multiple national lines. And so a lot of the time it's just easy to work with one studio so that you can kind of keep the scope and scale of it under control. So this is a lot. And another thing that's a lot, let's talk about it now, is the animation itself, especially in the 2D sections, but my god, also in the 3D sections, because we've talked a lot about animation on this channel before. Specifically about some of the principles that underlie different styles of animation production, especially when you're talking about 2D animation. I've talked often about the difference between Disney-style sort of cinematic animation and anime-style television format, like weekly format episode animation. I've talked about the differences between full animation and limited animation, and here we have a case study in some of the interesting ways that these things intersect, because usually when you deal with limited animation, as I've talked about before, what you've got is exactly what it sounds like. You animate the absolute minimum required in order to bring the action across. Think about old Hanna-Barbera cartoons, where like when Scooby and Shaggy and the gang are running, you'll get this one loop of all of the characters sort of in unison together as one big group, and then you just scroll the background behind them. And that gives the sense of forward momentum without having to animate every single character independently interacting with gravity and the environment. It looks a little floaty, but it works. It's limited animation. When you're looking at Disney-style animation, on the other hand, a lot of the times what you'll get is characters that are in full motion, like a lot of the time. Same thing goes for Ghibli animation. When you're dealing with full animation, you get characters that act with their entire body. You can see like they move their heads and shoulders around. Whereas with anime, during a dialogue or conversation scene and with limited animation, oftentimes a character will only move their mouth or do like minimal head movements. This is full animation. And it's tempting to say that, oh, well, if it's full animation, then it can't be anime, because anime is a style that's like predicated on limited animation, surely. But no, anime is not just about the frame timings, it's not just about the rate of animation, it's not just about being limited animation, it is an aesthetic style. And this, certainly the 2D sections, but indeed also the 3D sections, falls squarely within the aesthetic tradition of anime, and we'll talk about that as we go on. That comes across in a lot of the ways that all of this is animated, not just the character animation. It's an incredibly impressive piece of work, because once again, let me see if I can... There's one particular scene that I want to gravitate towards. It's a flashback that Yasuo has about his brother. There. This bit right here. This is the one that sort of exemplifies the sheer amount of unnecessary effort that went into creating this thing, because you have a character, they're doing a walk cycle, we're kind of zoomed out, we're not getting like the full detail of the characters, we're not looking at the thing entirely. It's a zoomed out, it's a low detail shot. It's not really an important shot either. This is not one that needs a crap ton of attention. And you'll remember we talked about in the Spirit Blossom Yone trailer, the one where we saw what happened to Yone after he died, went to the spirit realm, got confronted by a demon, defeated it, but then maybe also got possessed. It's not clear. What I talk about there is like in the zoomed out shots when we're like really far away, oftentimes the animators will go, okay, we're not zoomed in, we don't need a lot of detail, we don't need to animate everything else. We can animate a little bit more loosely, we can go on some like slow frame times. It doesn't really matter because you don't need that expressiveness that you need when you're close up. Take a look at how Yone walks away here. That's buttery smooth! That's buttery smooth! What the hell? Why? Why did they do this? I don't know, but I love them. I love them for doing it. This is animated on ones. Of all things, they didn't need to. It's not necessary. Like, they didn't have to do that, but they did. Which is, like, 1, 2... Look how incredible. Like, I'm tempted to even think, like, is this 3D animation? Like, did they just sneak a 3D model in there and like just let that do the walking so that it would look really smooth and I just didn't notice? But no, I don't think they I don't think they did. Why did they need to make it that smooth? And understand this, I'm not criticizing it. I'm not criticizing it even a little bit. I am in awe that they spent that much effort on these smooth-ass walk cycles that they just didn't need to. Like, it was not at all necessary to make the animation that smooth. Like, because remember, this video file is playing back at 24 frames per second. That means for 1 second of movement, you need to do 24 drawings in order to be animating on ones. This whole section where he walks away takes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 seconds of animating a character's walk cycle on ones. That's 7 times 24. I'm terrible at math, but that's something like it's 160 drawings or something like 160 individual drawings of Yone just walking away. 160 just to do that 7 seconds of nothing. That's a lot of effort. That's a hell of a lot of hard work, because even though you might think like oh, it looks so smooth, like you just have to animate the in-betweens, that surely can't be that difficult. No, it is difficult, especially when you're dealing with stuff like the detailing on Yone's coat here, which, look at that, when he moves, like how consistent the detailing of his coat is, even though like it's swinging around and flapping a little bit in the wind as he's walking. This is so extra. I love it, but I'm also confused by it because it's just in my head. I'm like, but surely they could have spent that animation budget better elsewhere. Except no, they don't need to because this whole thing has a huge animation budget. I really fucking hope that the animators were paid properly for their rates of payment in the animation industry are garbage. Like, they just are. Even Disney has had some trouble paying their animators their fair share. But especially when it comes to the outsourced animation that you see in especially a lot of TV anime, stuff like The Simpsons, a lot of it is outsourced to animation farms that just basically crank out the shit on schedule and command, and the working conditions tend to be awful. I really hope there wasn't a ton of crunch involved producing this thing. I hope the animators were compensated fairly, and I hope they weren't working on inhuman time constraints, which is often the case in the animation industry. I hope they were given time, paid time off, sick leave, especially given the pandemic. Like, it's just when I see something of this high quality, I just get worried about about all the backroom politics that goes in, because a piece of animation is never just a piece of animation. It's a product that's the product of a lot of people's hard work and of the industry that creates that product, and that industry has problems. That spooks around in the back of my mind. But anyway, that's enough preamble. That only took, I don't know, how long have we been talking? 12 minutes. Let's get into actually talking about the animation itself. And first of all, gorgeous use of light and color in this whole thing. We'll be talking about that a lot. Also, take a look at the little grassy things there in the background. These are just 2D static images. We've talked about this kind of animation technique before, where, like, this shot is not important. You don't need to animate these leaves, like, animating them on ones to get the individual fibrillations of the little twigs and stuff. Right, these are just 2D images that are being bent on motion tweens. And you can see that, like, they're basically just deforming 2D images in order to get this thing to look that way. And there's lots of little optimizations like that, where modern production technique kind of, okay, we don't need to animate the grass itself, we can just have some 2D images that we kind of move back and forth. Let's take a look at the character animation, though. And here's where we get into the whole thing about, like, whether this qualifies as anime. It does, because of the aesthetics of its movements. So here we're animating on 1s and 2s a little bit. Let's see. 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, so you can see they vary the rate of animation. It's not like TikTok, like clockwork on ones everywhere. But this is where we talk about, like, the movement aesthetic of animation. I saw an animator once give a talk about how he would describe the difference in style between Western style animation and anime animation. And what he said was that Western style animation is like a vertical line, whereas anime style animation is like a slanted line. It's like basically like a forward slash. And what he demonstrated with that is that anime oftentimes deals with a different elasticity of motion. And this is really freaking hard to describe when I can't, like, literally animate things on screen. I'll figure out some way. But basically, anime often deals with the build-up and release of tension in the way that it animates. And you can see that happening here. Here's a good example. Yone, like, he gets into this preparation pose, like he's getting ready to pounce. This is the build-up of tension, and then there. That's the snap. That's the release of tension. It's not a smooth motion. Like, it's not like he just goes, It's once he gets into motion, we get this very smooth buildup of him, like, slowly crouching into a position, slowly getting into it. And then once he moves, though, he's just gone. Like, there's no smoothing in between these two frames. It's just, bye-bye. And again, this has very little to do specifically with, like, the number of frames that are being used. It's little to do with animating on 1s, 2s, 3s, or 4s, or whatever. It has something to do with the aesthetic of how you present the buildup of motion, how you present action. And that's a big part of what makes, like, the visual language of anime, like, that it has built up over a long time. Because that... Well, first of all, there's a whole history of Japanese cinema which often deals with the buildup of and release of dramatic tension in a lot of ways. Like, think about the classic samurai duel with two samurai just standing there looking at each other for ages until all of a sudden everything happens all at once, and one samurai draws their sword, and then holy shit, and then one of them falls over and one of them died. Somehow you didn't see what happened. This tension and build-up, it's a part of Japanese cinema for a very long time, but it filtered into anime as, like, because anime is part of the Japanese cinema tradition, and became part of it, and it also worked very well with the budgetary constraints of anime, because anime has to work within like these very, very, very tight budgets. So for them, it suited the animation directors just fine that you could spend a whole lot, like several seconds or even like a whole minute just lingering on one frame of animation and have this quiet buildup of tension. And then when the actual action happens, oh yeah, just like do one flash frame and then like a swipe, and then the character has already completed the slice and he's standing in his finished position and the enemy is dead. That's a great way to do an action scene where you don't have to animate a whole sword fight. That works perfectly fine. I'm oversimplifying things. I'm like, highly oversimplifying things. It's a lot more complicated when you get into the details, but that's sort of the basic thing of how you recognize anime. Well, part of the reason is the build-up and release of tension, which is why 3D sections like this one also fit into the visual aesthetic of anime, because they have that same aesthetic of movement. They have that same approach to build-up and release of tension, which we see once we get into Yone and Yasuo's fight scene, but that's later after he is bathing naked to thirst bait all the horny fanboys and girls, and that certainly has worked. I've seen some people be very happy on my timeline. Where were we? Right, we were talking about the animation. That's technically the thing we're here to do. So, we got as far as this bit. Let's look at the next bit. This is why I'm splitting this up into 2 videos, by the way, because good lord. Oh, that's very good. Okay, this is a tiny small thing. So, Yone's run here is 1, 2, 1, 2. It's animated on 2s and occasionally 3s, like here. Which still is very, very smooth, but there's something clever happening, because like when you're animating, like when you have the ground and the camera moves on 1s. As you can see, every time I advance a frame, the ground moves. So the danger of that is that when Yone only moves on every 2nd or 3rd frame, then you can get this gliding effect where the background moves, but Yone just kind of stays in place without moving with it. So what the animators do very cleverly here is they make sure that when Yone's foot is planted on the ground, even though you can see that his character model doesn't change, like there's no change, and you can even see a little animation mistake here where you can see there's no body above here. They only animated the legs and like the lower part of his cloak, and here as the body slides forward a little bit too much, you can just kind of see the cutoff there, that there is no Yone above the legs that they're animating. But the clever thing they're doing is he puts his foot down here and steps on this bit of ground, and as that bit of ground moves backward into the frame, they slide Yone along with it, so that even though he's moving at essentially, you see it again here, essentially at a different frame rate than the animation itself. Oh boy, that one's really obvious. You don't get that sense of gliding, because he's always, like when he steps down on a piece of ground, he follows it. He sticks to it until he makes his own movement forward. And by the way, me pointing out these little animation mistakes, that's not really a criticism, because nobody saw, like, I didn't see them, and neither did you when you saw it moving at this speed. You don't notice it. Like, you can see it now that I've pointed it out. You can see that, oh yeah, there's a little bit of a weird gap happening, like up here every once in a while, but it doesn't matter in the full motion thing. It's not really an important animation mistake. It's one of those little production oversights that don't matter that much. Like, this might have been a shot that they only animated very late in the process, and it's one that we only linger on for a very short time. It's not especially important. So it's like, again, it's that thing about that eternal bugbear of animation of like, okay, but is it worth going back and cleaning this thing up and having animators do that thing? Is nah, it's fine, because no one's gonna see it. It doesn't matter. It doesn't ruin the flow of anything. Anyway, as Yone slows down, take a look at the way that his clothes move. See that? These two, look at the position of his legs. Don't change. They're completely unchanged. But from this frame to that frame, the clothes move on a different frame. Then the legs move. Then the clothes move. Then the legs move. Then the clothes change, then the legs. And so we have this offset animation timing. We've talked about that many times before, is that one of the ways in which you can get a character to look, or especially several characters to look better, especially when you're doing limited animation, like where you only have so many frames to work with, is to move them on different timings. So if a character only moves on every 2nd or 3rd frame, then move some of them like the legs, on one frame, and then on the next frame, move their clothes, and you get this asynchronicity to the way that they move that just gives them that little bit of extra life and flair. That makes them look a little bit more alive, because that means essentially the effect is that even though Yone here might only move his legs on every third or fourth frame, there's still stuff, there's still movement. Like you can see here, for example, that the sword also moves on a different timing than the legs. There's still movement in the frame. The character is still doing something, even if they're not moving all of their body, they're moving some of their body, and you get this greater illusion of smoothness. Like, it's essentially, you're kind of emulating what it would be like if you were animating on a faster frame timing, and it's just lovely to see. And again, that's something that an animator has to be good at, because if you do it wrong, it can look really weird and stilted and awkward, but they don't do it wrong. And here again, look at that build-up and release of tension. Zoom. Like, he just goes from there to here to there. Boof. But before that, we have the build-up, which is this. Like, slow, 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 very little movement, and then boom! All of a sudden, he is Shadow the Hedgehog charging at Sonic. By the way, has anyone noticed that Yone, especially in his demon form, is all black and red, and Yasuo is all blue? Just saying. Anyway, once more, we attempt to talk about the animation. Here again, you can see the same little trick that they're using. I think in this shot, probably the ground is 3D animated, and it'll be like a texture with a bunch of blur and visual effects laid on top of it. And then you have these blades of grass, which are 2D images, basically. You can see, I think some of them are copy-pasted, but not all of them. That essentially is inserted as flat 3D objects in the scene itself, and then the camera just moves really quickly across everything, and you get this. I really love that they made the camera go in between the blades of grass. That gives this wonderful 3D effect to Yone moving forward here. But you can see here, yeah, you can really see here that those blades of grass were not designed to be zoomed in on quite that much. You can see the artifacting all around the edges. Again, it doesn't matter because it's literally only on screen for one frame and you never see it in motion. But yeah, this is probably an implementation of 3D. And then again, build up and release of tension. Notice as we get to Yasuo here, stillness. We get this one moment that we just hold on for just one more frame than the rest of them, so that when you see it in motion, your eye has just enough time to take in, oh, that was Yasuo's face. It's only 2 frames. It's only twice as long as all the other frames that preceded, but it makes a difference. It makes it just that little bit more possible to just see that Yasuo's expression as he looks back and guards against Yone's attack. And by the way, the compositions here are also just quite lovely. Like, this is kind of a bold move a little bit, to have most of the frame really taken up by this muddy ground full of dirt and garbage, and then this whole corner of the frame is just landscape. It's just Ionian landscape, which of course is important because one of the things that Yasuo taunts Yone with is that, hey, you failed to defend Ionia, look at all this shit. This is presumably one of the battlefields that Singed used his chemical weapons on and wiped everything out and almost all life. Because that's a really central part of all Ionian lore, pretty much. But having the central characters just be these 2 tiny little things that are standing around over here. And let me just zoom in on them a little bit, which fortunately is a thing I can do in Premiere Pro. Whoop. So look at the detail on these characters. Again, here you see the consciousness that animation has about its budget. Look at Yone and Yasuo's heads, for example. Look at the crudeness of the way that they hold their swords and stuff. Again, you don't see this in the full size and scale of things. Let's see if I can track this properly. But this is one of those things where, like, there's no reason to render high-fidelity versions of Yasuo and Yone here in the background, because who cares? But the thing that they do focus on, the thing that they do render, where they spend quite a lot of time and attention to the details, is their clothing and Yasuo's hair, which does a lot of movement. And notice the reversal that goes on here. Yone charges in from the left. And he also uses wind techniques, remember. He doesn't use quite the same wind magic that Yasuo does. He hasn't been trained in that. But he was trained at the Wind Sword Magic Dojo, so he learned, like, some basics that inform the way that he moves around. So as Yone charges in, the wind comes from the left and blows against Yasuo. And you can see that in the way that the streamers and the clothes whip about. But as Yasuo pushes back, the wind switches direction, and all of a sudden it's pushing back against Yone in favor of Yasuo. Which is such a lovely, tiny little animation detail that really doesn't matter that much. Like, again, it's the kind of thing that you don't really see. But, like, when you pay attention to it there, you can see, like... And it's, again, that build-up of tension and build-up and release of tension. Because you get this tension as Yone clashes in, the wind flies over to the right side of the screen and builds up a little bit of tension. And as Yasuo pushes back, it snaps back. And Yone is pushed backwards. So you get this, like, this entire shot is also doing the work of building up the tension for Yasuo pushing Yone back right here, where he's using his wind magic to basically do it. And you can see that because he draws his sword out of its scabbard just a little bit. And once again, the attention to detail, or rather the attention to not having too much detail. Take a look at Yasuo's character model. Very simple, no eyes, like just the bare hints of anatomy that are necessary to communicate the character's pose, but very little actually going on in terms of detail. Like his cloak here is just like a flat color shape. The same thing goes for his pants. Because again, consciousness of the animation budget that's available. Whereas Yone, by contrast, is like, you still don't have a detailed face on him, but he's got a lot more detail on his costume because he's closer to the camera. And then you get that pushback, and I just... Man, the aesthetics of how... Look at how the clothes whip about in the wind in this shot, like, especially on Yone. Take a look at Yone's clothing, like how much they're being battered by the wind as he's being pushed back, how they flutter and flap and flail around. And then you get this, like, you can see his whole character model as he gets pushed back. His whole character model is deformed, like, and turned into this jagged, edgy little thing, almost as though the power of Yasuo's pushback is literally deforming his entire body. And then he gets pushed back, and then he, like, reforms back into something that's recognizably human. It's just lovely. Let's see. Here we are, I think Yone moves on 1s and 2s here. Let's see. Yeah, definitely on 2s. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1. And again, as we talked about before, in terms of like deciding which animation timing to use for a particular movement, that comes down to like what kind of feeling do you want the motion to have. If you want a very smooth, careful motion, you will animate things on 1s and 2s. If you want something that's a bit more jagged and fast, you might go for 3s, 4s, 5s, 6s, even 12s, like under certain extraordinary circumstances. You can do that, because it's really more about, like, it's about the feeling of motion that you do. And again, notice the animation timings. Yone doesn't move, Yasuo moves. Yasuo doesn't move, Yone moves. Yasuo moves, Yone moves. Yasuo and Yone move together. Yone moves 2 times, actually 3 times. Yasuo moves. And so you get this differential animation timing between each of their motions that, again... If you don't do that, if you don't have this differential, especially when you're working with limited animation, you can get characters that kind of look a little clockworky. Like, it could kind of look like they're moving on like the same machinery is powering both of them. So they're moving on exactly the same time. When you do the differentiation, you get a more dynamic scene, something that looks better. Which, again, is one of those things that's, for me, that's why it's fun to stop animation and just kind of frame to it. Oh, they made that decision about how, like, these characters move relative to each other in terms of timing. And mapping out those timings, by the way. Like, mapping out, making sure that each character moves enough that they still look animated without having these weird, awkward pauses where they just look like they're not moving at all. But also giving space for other characters to move on the timings in between them. That's difficult. Like, that takes planning. That takes takes effort. It's up to it's the collaboration with the storyboarders, the in-betweeners, and the keyframers to get that shit right, and the animation director to check it over. It's a lot of work to make that work. And now, look at this. I love this facial animation. This is just a little thing, but take a look at Yone blinking. There. Okay, let's just zoom in on him for a second. So take a look at... this is such a small thing, but I love it so much. So Yone rests... He moves his body... This is why this is not limited animation, by the way, because you see, as we're entering into this dialogue section, all of Yone is moving. This is not just a static anime head flapping its lips. There's a full body acting going on here. And the little detail that I love, as he's moving on 2s and 3s sometimes, is you see he starts talking, and then, like, he's opened his mouth here, then the eye, like, the eyebrow, rather, moves down as he opens his mouth, and then with nothing else moving, he blinks and opens his eye back up, and then, like, again, that differential timing on his movement, because that little desynchronization between the movement of the eye and like the movement of the mouth, oh, it's so good. Like, it makes the whole thing look so smooth, and it gives you that sense that, like, he's not an automaton operating on a timing system. He's a person whose body is doing, like, essentially involuntary movements, who's moving on like biological timing. And it's such a little thing, but it's so good. And also, notice the way that he talks, by the way, which again is very distinct from how, in anime, a lot of the times, you don't get characters who do that. A lot of the times, when you see characters from the side that are talking, they don't break the silhouette of the character model. Rather, the mouth itself is animated on top of the character model and just kind of moves without having to break the silhouette, without having to reanimate that part of the character model. Here, that's not what they do, and they've also got actual lip syncing going on here, which is a rarity again in anime. In anime, you often operate with mouth flaps, which is like a series of, so essentially cycling identical mouth movements that are just used over and over and over again to communicate that the character is speaking, but without necessarily relating to the sounds that they're producing directly. Here, we have actual lip sync. You can see that the animators, like here we have like an O sound. There we have, like, his mouth is open, tongue is back, so there's like an ah kind of thing, Yasuo. So, like, you can't read his lips necessarily, because it's still, like, you can see they're still operating with, like, a series of predefined shapes, but there's actual, like, you can see that Yone is actually forming the words in his mouth. And again, it's the kind of thing that, when you see it here, you're not sitting there looking, oh, I can read his lips, that's interesting, but it's the kind of thing that nerds like me just go, and also his jaw is moving, that's another thing, like his jaw is moving up and down with the motion of his talking, which again in anime is really a rarity, because again, that's extra animation that you have to do, where you could easily save a bunch of time and effort on just having mouth flapping on the character's model without having to break the silhouette, without having to move the jaw, just mouth flaps. Easy way to save money. It doesn't really impact the storytelling that much. It's not super important, but here they've done it anyway because this thing is so fucking extra. Now let's talk about Yasuo's hair. How long have we been going? Oh, half an hour, and we are 22 seconds. 22 seconds into the animation. This is why I'm breaking it up into pieces and parts. I'm really excited. But, oh my god, I'm gonna need a cup of tea or something. Yasuo's hair. Anyway, Yasuo's hair is so clever. I love it so much. Because it's on fire. His hair is made of fire. Look at it. Let's zoom in on it since we can. His hair is on fire. That's such a clever way to deal with it. Because Yasuo has one of those really annoying haircuts where, like, he has this giant motherfucking ponytail that somehow stands up under its own weight and doesn't really look like hair at all. It looks like he's got like a porcupine on his head or something like that. This is anime hair bullshit, right? But here we have all this wind effect, and we need, like, the wind to be whipping around, and we get this dramatic scene between the brothers. So how do we do that? Well, we just set his hair on fire. We just turn his hair into essentially like liquid or smoke or flames. And we let the hair be this flat color surface with some gradients on it, obviously, that just kind of moves like flame in the wind. And you get the effect that you're looking for, which is to have like a sense of billowing in his hair, but you don't have to animate 14 billion individual hair strands in order to make it work. Plus, it's a really fucking cool stylization. Like, it just makes him look really freaking cool. And they do something similar with his cloak, by the way, which is essentially also just a flat color surface. You can see some gradients going on, some horrible blocky YouTube compression. YouTube, goddammit, you're compress things all to hell. But yeah, again, his cloak is just this flat color surface with a little bit of shadow on the background that is essentially allowed to move more like a liquid, like more like it was made of some like amorphous kind of blob of slime or something than actual cloth. But because because it's just like a flat color surface, it really works. It's just lovely little optimizations. And this is much more in line with what you would see in like TV anime. Where here's where you have like, let's zoom in on Yasuo a little bit, like more elaborate mouth movements than you'd usually get. But his talking is still, like you can see mostly his jaw doesn't move much. It does a little bit here. And he is shaping the words more than an anime character normally would. But here you get something that's much more like typical anime production, where the vast majority of the character doesn't move even a little bit. But we just have like some things flapping and some things cycling. And this like cycle of mouth flaps to deliver the dialogue. Except, of course, Yasuo opens his eyes to get this badass look, and as he does, as he gets more angry, he also opens his mouth up wider, and he shows his teeth more, which gives us a sense of his emotional state as he's delivering this bit of his dialogue, which is just lovely and good, and I love it. And then we get, this is again the classic anime thing, where if this was TV anime, you would have 2, maybe 3 frames probably, a 3-frame cycle of animation for like Yasuo's hair over there on the right. Again, taking advantage of my ability to zoom in. You'd have like maybe 3 frames that cycled over and over and over again with Yasuo, like with his stuff moving. But here again, because they're so extra, and you'd have that cycling like on 2s or 3s or something like that. But here, you have this like really smooth looking lovely bit. And the same thing goes for Yone. Like, Yone probably in TV anime, they wouldn't even bother really doing any animation on his clothing because it's not flappy enough to really warrant it. And then you'd linger on this shot for like 20 seconds while the characters just deliver dialogue at each other without anything ever happening, also known as the Dragon Ball method. Because that's a convenient way to save some money and time. But no, here they have to go a little bit extra. So you've got the fog moving across, you've got like the leaves of grass, you've got the camera sort of slowly panning out, the sky moving overhead. We cut to a shot of the sky. As a bit of setup here, the rain intensifies. All of a sudden, whoa, raining a lot more. And then classic anime, not showing the eyes of the character. Which is mirrored again with Yone here, who's also not, you're also not seeing his eyes as we enter the shot here. But not showing the eyes, typically in anime aesthetic, is an indicator of like hidden motivations, or like that there's something going on that you're not quite privy to with the character's emotional state, that they're hiding some sort of a secret, or they're saying something that is dark or hidden. And specifically in this case, what Yasuo is doing is directly taunting his brother about his failure to protect Ionia. Like, as Yone is like, Yasuo, you need to come back and answer for your crimes, and Yasuo is like, what right do you have to lecture me about honor? Look at what's happening around you. You failed to stop this, so how could you possibly lecture me? And what I get from the decision to obscure Yasuo's eyes as he says this is that maybe he doesn't quite mean what he says right at this moment. Maybe he doesn't quite mean that Yone failed to defend Ionia. Maybe he's just kind of lashing out a little bit because he doesn't particularly enjoy being accused of murder and stuff. So like maybe it's not quite... that's the hiding of the motivation, whereas with Yone, whose eyes are hidden at first, but then come into view, is being more honest by saying like better than living without honor, like better to have failed at honor than to live without it. And oh my god, this bit of Captain Samurai Pants leaning down, because again, they're so fucking extra, like my god. Okay, are you noticing it? Like, are you seeing what I'm seeing here? Just I really hope you are. Look at his goddamn clothes. Look at his clothes. Okay, so we get from this, like, this static standing position where his clothes are pretty, like, they're smooth, and there's a little bit of folding and stuff like that. That's fine. But as he gets ready to charge, look what happens. A wind essentially kicks up, personalized on him, and starts whipping like the folds of his whatever it is, hakama kimono, whatever, just whipping it around like that, and it stays in motion the whole time while he's bending down, while he's delivering dialogue with his little mouth flaps, like while he's actually, and again, if you take a look at his mouth, he's forming the words, he's actually doing mouth animation while he's moving his swords around, while he's stepping forward, leaning down on one leg, getting ready, while his scabbard back there is maintaining an immaculate three-dimensional shape, moving correctly with his body. As he leans forward and gets ready to dash, They do this with his clothing, having it flapping around in the wind, keeping that movement consistent. You can even see it. Like, you can see how this fold down here travels upwards along the rim of his coat. Like there, you can see how it moves upwards and resolves into the bit around his neck. Keeping that shit consistent from frame to frame as the character is doing like 5 billion other things at the same time, it is so extra. Like, you didn't need to do that. You didn't have to. Why? That wasn't necessary, but it looks cool and I love it. And it's like the whole dash just gets this impatient, powerful energy because his whole body becomes animated by like the power that he's about to deliver onto his poor brother there. It's like, oh god, it's so good. We are 42 seconds into this piece of animation. We've talked for 44 minutes. I'm gonna keep checking in with that because it amuses me endlessly how bad I am at keeping this short. Okay, some combat animation then. And here you can see like Yone is barely more than literally a blur as he and Yasuo, like Yasuo moves into the frame first and then Yone comes in and is like, he's just this unfocused blur of a thing, and that's blur that's applied. Like they didn't draw the blur. Like the animator didn't sit down and draw him blurred out. That's an effect that they apply afterwards, but it works very well to sort of give us this disorienting dash of motion first, and then the first character who resolves, who becomes really visible, is Yasuo. He unblurs, lands, and then Yone becomes visible in this ready pose. 2 swords out. He's down, Yasuo is a little bit off balance, Yone has the advantage, he swings at his brother, and then we get these. And again, this is anime aesthetic full stop. This is an animation smear, and now I've talked about those many times before. I love animation smears. But specifically this kind of animation smear that traces the arc of a swing like this is something that's a lot more emblematic of how anime tends to handle stuff like a flash of moving metal, or indeed like just a swing of an arm. Is much more emblematic of that than the ways in which, for example, a Disney animator would handle the same kind of a thing. Although, like in recent years, like the distinction between Western and Eastern animation, between anime and Western animation, is getting more and more arbitrary because Western animation has taken a ton of inspiration from anime, and the same thing in turn. Like anime was originally inspired by Disney movies. That's the first anime that people mostly talk about when they talk about anime as an art movement was Astro Boy, and Astro Boy was directly influenced by the character design and animation of Pinocchio, like the Disney 1942, I think, film, 1940s. I think it was a 1940s film. With Osamu Tezuka explicitly being inspired by those character designs, and the animation production on that film also being inspired by Disney, although at a much lower budget, and those budgetary constraints then eventually led to the development of the style of anime itself, also influenced by traditional Japanese art. That's not what this was about. He's swinging some swords. Let's talk about a sword fight. So again, notice it's a little thing, but notice again the use of animation timings, and again, let's zoom in on things, just because we can. Whoop. So we can see it happening for real. So again, differential animation timings. Yone finishes his slash right here, and he doesn't really move from that position for a bit, but Yasuo makes one movement, and his hair is being used very cleverly here to trace his motion. So like here, because he's leaning down and backwards, the hair is essentially tracing the arc of his motion. And the same thing goes for here. As he swings his head around, you can see the hair traces the motion of his head. But Yone, even like the flapping bits of his costume, does not move for these 3 frames, while Yasuo gets to make a little movement. And then Yone moves, and then Yasuo moves, and then Yone moves, and Yasuo move together. And then there's like this constant care put into maintaining some differentiation of the character's movement timings, like making decisions about when they need to move together. Like here, when Yone slashes at Yasuo and he dodges at the same time, they need to move together. But then here, as Yone gets ready to go into a second swing, Yasuo doesn't need to move for that until he needs to set up for his own movement as Yone swings the swords down, and then Yasuo moves while Yone shifts a little bit. They move together, and then Yasuo and Yone move on differentiation. differentiated timings. And that's over and over and over again. The animator, presumably it'll have been the same animator animating both characters for these interaction sequences, constantly has to make those decisions about when do I move each character? Like, when is it appropriate to make one character move simultaneously, and when do they need to move on independent timings? When does one character need to set up a motion more, while the other character needs to not be distracting from that setup of motion? And all of it, like, again, when it's all in motion, you don't notice it. Like, that's kind of the tragedy of animation a lot of the time, is like, the more work goes into it, the more invisible that work tends to become. Like, the less you tend to notice how hard all of this is to put together when a ton of work has gone into making it look completely freaking effortless. Oh, I like this so much. Because here again, we have the 3-dimension problem. And here you can kind of see what I was talking about with the gliding effect, right? Because Yasuo lands here, and for 2 frames, like, he doesn't move, but the background moves around him. And when I slow it down like this, you can see what I meant when I talked about the gliding effect, where the character isn't quite following the movement of the ground quite perfectly. And here, again, with the running, because we were seeing Yone's feet planted on the ground, like we were seeing his feet, that gliding effect would have been way more noticeable in motion if they hadn't taken care to compensate for it. Here, because we can't see the ground itself, we can only see, like, the receding bits of grass flying around in the receding background with the parallax scrolling effects. We don't notice it as much. Like, the gliding isn't really a problem. You don't notice it in motion. But you might have noticed it in motion with Yone's feet. And there's just so much management, because, like, Yone starts over on the left here, then he dashes to the right, then he jumps up into the air like this, and he actually stays in that position for, like, just an extra frame to give Yasuo another moment to grab a sword out of the ground and get it ready, because he doesn't want to use his wind magic on his brother. And then the clash. And just, like, just the inertia and gravity that they're working with here. Because, like, let's start with Yasuo landing from his jump here. His feet come into frame first, just a pander to the feet enthusiast, I suppose. Then he lands, and you can see, like, his whole weight, like, his entire body thuds into the ground, and all of the weight is being planted on his feet. He gets into this deep, low crouch, and then he gets up. And note the little things again. See what moves here? Most of his body doesn't, but all the things that are flapping around on him, like his fire hair and his cloak and his drinking bamboo, whatever the hell that is, moves on independent timings from the rest of him to really give him that chaotic energy. But again, the managing of gravity and weight, where he lands, then he has to spend a little bit of time standing up, then he grabs the sword, then he braces, and you can see he shifts his feet around just a little bit to like, accommodate that deflection that he's doing there. And as he deflects Yone here, he gets pushed back himself. Look. He has to take a step backwards in order to regain his balance because he gets pushed off balance. You can see it here, that his center of gravity has shifted, and he needs to compensate, moves his foot away from it. Meanwhile, Yone, who's landing on the ground, he gets slashed down to the side, so he does the same thing Yasuo did, like this really low pose where you can see he's trying to catch his entire body weight on his leg. So you have this deep, elastic springing effect as he kind of springs back up into shape after that. And you can see that even here he's preparing for another sword blow because he's raising up the swords behind him. And then we cut on motion to here, where it's pretty much already happening, where you can see he's finishing that sword blow that he was setting up in the previous shot. And again, the use of animation smears, rather than actually animate, rather than just have, if the swing is really fast, rather than just snapping from one position to another, we trail the motion of the sword so that we can see exactly what's happening as they clash together. And the other lovely thing about these smears is they're so dynamic. Like, they have these really powerful dynamic shapes that really imply a crap ton of really fast, lethal motion, which is also why they're in white. It's not just because, like, oh, swords are reflective, metallic, or whatever. It's also to indicate their power. Essentially that they're slashing through the air like they're white hot, they're wind, they are fire. And, like, dual-wielding animation is always, like, a hell of a thing, because you have to manage, like, the balance and the movement of the swords and how the character is doing it. So, from here, Yone slashes down, and now his weight is over here. His sword arms are all over here. So what he does is he reverses here with one sword arm first, boom, and then the other one follows, like, smoothly right thereafter. And then he spins around and gets another hit in like that. And it's like, you're looking at it from above, by the way, which is a difficult angle to animate from, because, like, you can't rely on a lot of the things that you otherwise rely on. There's so much careful management of momentum. Like, there's so much careful management of, like, where is Yone's swords right now? What move can he do from the position that he's in right now? How can we translate that into, like, keeping this circular, spinning, rotational motion that Yone always has got going on, like, where he's always swinging and reversing momentums and spinning around himself. Whereas Yasuo is doing a little bit more like a fencer. Like, he's basically just fending him off. Like, rather than doing all of Yone's, like, spinning around, rotational, swooping motions all the time, Yasuo has these tiny little flicks of the wrist, basically. Where you can kind of see he's almost barely moving the sword, really, more than is absolutely necessary to deflect what Yone is doing to him. And then he does this step in. I really like this. Like, they can see he brings up the sword, he's getting ready to strike, and then he does this step in, like, lunging towards his brother, who's already moving away, who's already seen it coming. And then he gets that slash in. So nice. And again, that build-up and release of tension. Here, Yone, you can even see a visualization of the power that he's building up, in that his swords are, like, making sparks as they crack together. And then there's the lightning strikes, just to get the extra cliche in there. He does the swing and shatters Yasuo's borrowed blade. And I love the dynamism, because, like, they're always moving. That's the lovely thing about this fight scene, is that they don't just stand still and flail their swords at each other like they're in Revenge of the Sith or something, which has some really static sword fights sometimes. Here, like, they're constantly moving, they're constantly changing their footing, they're constantly moving around each other, circling, shifting positions, getting to the side of one another. There's this constant jostling for position that's just really lovely. And that's what makes the scene feel so dynamic as a fight scene, is that it's not just two dudes swinging swords at each other. They're like dancers. Like, they're constantly, like rotating around to the same axis of each other, looking for an in, looking for a way to like, exert momentum over the other. And it's just fantastic. Like, I don't have that much to comment on, because, like, I feel like so much of it is self-evident when you look at it, especially when you look at it frame by frame. That, like, just from the choreography that's going on here, that's both down to the animator, the storyboarder, the in-betweener certainly also has a lot of effect on it, and the animation director. I should probably define some terms here, by the way. So when I say the animator, usually the person I'm talking about there is the keyframe animator, the lead animator. I don't know what the production setup is on this particular short, but in Disney animation, what you'd usually have is you would have a lead animator who would do what's called the keyframes. These are the most important poses. Let me see if I can find a good example of keyframes. I mean, they're everywhere, but it's just, I'm trying to find one that scans well. Right, for example, Yone here. That right there, that would be a keyframe. Like, that's the most extreme position that he's in before he's about to do something. And then here, as he's completely, as he has finished the move and is getting ready for another one, where, like, he has his swords raised, that's a second keyframe. And then maybe you have a third keyframe, which is like this right here, which is the extreme of the motion in the middle. And the lead animator would be responsible for creating the motion with the keyframe, maybe the central thing, and then where does the motion end? And the job of the in-betweener is to basically do all the other stuff, all the frames in between those key poses that is necessary to deliver the character, like to deliver the character motion that is desired. And the lead animator would give feedback, and there's a whole process there. those are the two people who are typically responsible for character animation. In Japanese animation, it sometimes works a little bit differently. Sometimes you have like the Sakuga thing, where it's one animator who just works really intensively on just one thing for a long time. And sometimes you don't have in-betweeners in that, and sometimes you do. It's complicated. It depends on the size of the production team, like because of course small independent animation studios can't afford to have both lead animators and a bunch of in-betweeners. Their animators have to do the whole thing all on their own. So that's a production thing. The storyboarder, on the other hand, is neither of these things. Typically, they work closely with the animation director and the script to lay out the major beats. So the storyboarder would, for instance, draw like a couple of frames, perhaps, a couple of rough sketches of Yasuo standing here and Yone standing there, and like him being in the first position up here, and then maybe being in the final position as he dashes forward. But they don't do any of the actual, as it were, animation, except they do, it's part of the animation process. But they're the ones who lay out, like, what's the sequence of the shots, what's the composition, like Yasuo and Yone move from this spot in the frame to that spot over there in the frame, and Yasuo jumps up. Like, they lay out, like, the very basics of what is supposed to happen in this scene. Then the keyframe animator takes that and goes, okay, so the major movements are this, and this. And then the in-betweener takes that and goes, okay, so let's just add all the stuff in between to make this look smooth and look good. And that's, I'm still oversimplifying. The animation director, then, is the guy who's in charge of everything all at once, who's in charge of, like, making sure that the storyboarder presents the script correctly, who's in charge of making sure that when the keyframe animator delivers what they're doing, that the acting of the character is on par with what's supposed to be happening in the story and the lore of the thing. And it's the animation director will often also work with, like, the sound department to make sure that the animation, like, matches the motion and movement and mood of the sound that's provided. That's the whole thing. So when I say the animator, when I'm talking about this stuff, I'm actually talking about like 4, 5, maybe 6 people all at once who all collaboratively create this one thing that we call an animation, but it's never a one-person job. Like, unless it's literally a one-person studio, unless it's literally just only one person doing everything, anytime you see animation, especially at this level of quality, like, it's a lot of people who are responsible for all of it. Like, because it's tempting to say, oh, the keyframe animator, that's the important animator, that's the superstar. That's where you often hear names like Glenn Keane or, what's his face, animated Shirkan, Milt Kahl, and the grand old men of Disney and people like that. That's where you'll often hear those names thrown around. So, oh, these great animators. Yeah, they did a lot of fantastic work. They were incredibly skilled, but the animation that they produced is also produced in collaboration with their in-betweeners, with their animation director, with their storyboard artists, and indeed with their colorists. Animators often don't, like, they rarely are responsible for coloring their own animation, and that's also part of what the animation director has to do, is to make sure that the coloring, like, matches the mood and the motion and everything. So it's like, it's a lot. It's a lot. And that's one of the things that, again, the tragedy of animation is that when it's really good, it looks so effortless that you don't even notice the sheer mind-boggling amount of hard work that goes into making any animation work and look good. So that's one of the things that I try to do with these animation breakdowns, is make that a little bit more visible, that, like, in order for any of this to happen, like, because even the sparking effects like this, that can be the job of just, like, an effects animator. Someone who doesn't do any of the character animation, but who takes the character animation and goes, okay, let's add a bunch of wind effects. Let's add, like, when we have the clash between Yone and Yasuo here, it's entirely possible that the person responsible for all this cool wind effect, all this push and pull, all these little swoops and circles that are going on around here, is a completely different person from the storyboarder, the lead animator, or the in-betweener. Like, it's a lot of people it takes. But again, I don't know the exact credits list or the way that these productions are structured, so I can't really speak to that. I'm just going to say that it's entirely probable that there's a lot more people involved with this than you might think at first glance. Because a shot like this one, that would be like the colorist, pretty much like the VFX artist doing the lightning, and then the colorist being responsible for presenting this, like, highly stylized edge lighting and the shadows on his back while keeping the lighting from the thing, and then this super stylized black and white instant shot as Yone charges forward. That would be the colorist. That would be the colorist and the VFX artist. That wouldn't really be the lead animator doing probably any of that. So, like, credit for animation is like always a big collaborative thing. And I do love, like, I love the trope, like, of having, like, literally a lightning strike as he strikes with lightning speed. That's just a lovely thing. And then we get this little braggy Matrix bullet time shot where everything slows down. And Yasuo and Yone are animated on 2s, and they're animated on exactly the same timing as well. You can see that, like, when Yasuo, when his hair moves, Yone's hair moves. When Yone's body moves down a little bit, Yasuo's hand moves down a little bit. They're completely in sync right now, because that's the feeling we need to have here. We need to have that uncanny feeling of super slow motion, where everything seems to be almost moving on, like, tiny, slow little rails, as we have these raindrops suspended in air, falling down, and the sword slowly rotating with the power of the blow. And I love the uncertainty that you get here. Like, that little uncertainty, like, where it's like, holy shit, did he get him? Like, did Yone actually hit Yasuo, or did he just break the sword? What exactly happened? You can't quite tell. And it lingers on it for so long until we get a shot of Yasuo, and then you can see, oh, the only wound. That's how Yasuo got his wound across his face. You can see it literally opening up here, because he managed to block most of what happened. And that's just like, oh, that's porn. Like, this is just bragging. Because this is really fucking hard. Also, again, this fucking piece of animation goes so fucking hard and doesn't need to. This is bragging. Like, this is I won't say easy, but it's like relatively simple to do a shot like this when you're having 3D animation and 3D models, because you can rely on motion tweens. You can just have the character models do a motion, but really slowly, and you don't, like, it takes away a bunch of the effort that it takes to create these really slow motions. But here, you can't just rely on quickly snapping from one position to another. You can't just rely on doing quick motions like you normally can with a lot of 2D animation, where you can hide a lot of sins just by having a character move a little bit quickly from one position to another without having to worry about how they get there. When you're doing this ultra slow motion bullshit, and it is bullshit, but it's so good, like, it's lovely bullshit, you have to know what's the gravity of Yone's cloak right here? What's the gravity of this bit? What's the gravity of Yasuo's, like, shoulder covering thing there? How exactly does his hair move in the wind under the load of gravity? How fast exactly should Yone's body be moving downwards with gravity after the slash? How exactly should this bit of the sword be rotating in space, given the force that's coming down from above, making it spin ever so slightly? The animator needs to know that shit. Like, the animator needs to put thought and care and attention into the exact gravity of everything that's moving right now, because when it moves this slowly, when we get this really painfully slow step-by-step visualization of every little bit of gravity interaction that happens, it needs to look right, because if it doesn't, then your character looks unnatural, they look weightless, they look wrong, rather than this, which looks fucking flawless, frankly. And the same thing here, like, this is another thing that's so deceptively fucking hard. That little tiny... Look at Yasuo's head here. Let me just zoom in on the timeline so I can do this more precisely. Look at that. Like, that little twist. Like, he goes from looking mostly to the right, and then he looks a little bit over towards the broken sword that's flying down. You can see his eyebrows are clenching up, his face is getting angry, you can see the scar manifesting on his head. Let me zoom in on this, because it's so fucking cool. He rotates his head around so slowly in three-dimensional space. You can see the cheek over here appearing from behind the front of his lips. You can see the nose slowly rotating around its own axis. You can see more of his closed eye over here as it opens up very slowly, and more of it rotates into view. The same thing with the eyebrows. You can see, like, how his jaw and his neck and, like, the shape of his ear and, like, his hairline and his beard, how all of that moves three-dimensionally. And again, that's really fucking hard. Like, when you can move quickly, when you can just snap between positions, it's relatively easy to turn a character around. But when you have to know and understand the exact three-dimensional shape of this anime motherfucker's facial construction in order to rotate it believably in 3D space really, really slowly, that takes work, and that takes skill. And I'll be, like, reiterating that refrain over and over and over again throughout this entire fucking thing. It's work and it's skill. And there's no cheating. Like, you can't cheat this. You have to do it right. You have to know what the hell you're doing, because if you don't, this won't look right. This will look terrible. They go so hard, they don't need to. They could have just kept him static. They could have just kept him static without having him rotate his head, but they did it anyway because it creates a more dynamic shot as the scar appears across his nose and the sword is rotating around its axis. And even the sword, like, this is one of those things where, like, I would have sworn the sword blade was just a 3D object. Like, because it's gray and it's metallic, it's reflective, you know? Like, you can just have a 3D object rotating in space. That's fine, nobody would have noticed. But look at... Would you look at that? Look at this. Look at the edge here, the broken edge. That's not a 3D object, because you can see the lines, the imperfections, like the tiny little imperfections in the sword. This is not a 3D object rotating. This is someone doing this shit by hand. They didn't need to, but they did. I don't know why, but it's so cool. Oh, God. Right. Anyway, moving on. How long have we been going? Oh, over an hour. We are 54 seconds into this thing. And here we get a lot of what I really like in anime style motion. The speed lines. Like, I always had a weakness for those. I really like them. And you can see those, like, you get these speed lines, and it's this impossibly long swing, right? Like, it's Yone's swords coming around to finish the job. But even though they're, like, we can see from the ground all the blurring, like, it's, wow, they're moving so fast. But notice how long the shot is. Like, it's like a full 2 seconds for his swords just to swing around one time, even though they're moving so fast. Because, well, this is because of the drama. Like, it's because we need to have that time of seeing, holy shit, the swords are coming. And then Yasuo also has, like, let's see. Yeah, a full second to draw his weapon and respond to it. Which, of course, like, in actual motion, this would take, like, a fraction of a second, and Yasuo would already be dead by now, but because of the drama, we get this long, extended tracking shot of, like, the light glinting menacingly off the blade as they zoom across this, like, rapidly dashing past background, flying up, and then we see Yasuo beginning to react to it. And this is such a cool motion as well. And here you can see the use of these speed lines that I was talking about to get these quick motions, like to get this sense of snappy movement, where you can see this deformation of all the lines on the character as he reaches in, and then you get this stillness of, like, he gets his hand into position fast, woof, and then there's this stillness, this slow and, like, dainty. Look how he grasps the blade. This dainty little, one finger out. Oh, cheerio, my dear. Shan't grasp the blade with too many fingers at once. And then he gets a grip on it. And then, as you can see, the power begins to build up. Even as he draws the blade, you can see how it, like, the power that he's about to unleash is already beginning to affect the world around him. You can see how the wind just basically starts bursting out of the scabbard as the blade comes out, whipping around his hand with such force that it deforms him. And as the blade itself is drawn, that shit just gets ramped up to 11. And we get this hyper stylized, really fucking badass. And again, it's probably a VFX artist who did all of this cool wind effect all around it. As every line on his body is deformed, and everything becomes deformed in the power of the movement that he's about to unleash. Wow-woom! Poof! And the lovely little detail with the raindrops. And again, build up and release of tension. Because Yasuo, like, he gets his sword out. Boom. They have clashed. The swords have now collided. And it takes 2 seconds, pretty much, before, like, with just this buildup of tension, with Yone's momentum crashing into Yasuo's and these powers colliding, and you can see the wind magic in Yasuo's blade rapidly, like, whipping around everything that's happening before it overcomes him, and we get whoosh. And you can see the raindrops just getting blasted out by this cone of energy and power. Whoom. All of a sudden, it's not raining anymore, and then splash! Again, props to the VFX artist, because that's... Woof. And you can see a little bit of raindrops, like, around them, but none of the raindrops are falling in front of Yasuo. And they're not falling in front of Yone either, until all of the rain that's been held back comes crashing down. It's such a lovely, cool little detail to really emphasize the power that Yasuo has in the sword. And also, from a storytelling perspective, Yasuo didn't want to use that sword against his brother. He grabbed another sword from the battlefield specifically to avoid having to use this weapon against his brother. That's part of the storytelling, is that he really doesn't want to do what he's about to have to do anyway. Man, like, the tension buildup is so good. And again, with the lightning strike. Build up and release of tension. It's not just in the animation, it's in the storytelling as well. Let's see. Again, differential animation timings. You can see Yone and Yasuo moving on different frames here. And again, the wind, which is so important to Yasuo thematically. Like, that wind is such a huge part of his character. So much work goes into... Take a look at the drinking bamboo thing that he's got on his wrist. Take a look at how much that just kind of whips around and rotates and messes around in the wind, right? You can really see how the wind is whipping it about. And the same thing with the ropes that he's got around his waist. So much work goes into making those have believable, chaotic motion in the wind, at the same time as the animator also has to make sure that the character is moving. And this, again, is like a really fucking difficult... Like, this is a difficult angle to animate because you're doing a lot of foreshortening. You're doing a lot of twisting the character's anatomy around to get them into the correct position. Like, you can see Yasuo's entire torso here. He has to twist his torso into a sideways position here. Take a look at how the animator does that. See how they manipulate the lines of the muscles on his back? And you get to see, like, the hip... and then the abs and a little bit of the chest sort of rotating slowly into view as Yasuo gets down into a position to strike. That's very sexy. Like, just as a technical bit of work, that's very sexy. And also, like, I'm sure people will appreciate the look at Yasuo's rippling pectorals there. Here's another underappreciated thing. I'm saying it's underappreciated, I don't know, but I think it's probably underappreciated. Yasuo's shoulder piece. Like, this ridiculous... don't know what the hell that thing is supposed to be. It looks so freaking heavy. Look how that moves as, like, his arm is curling inwards a little bit, like here, because he's raising the sword up. Look how the shoulder piece moves. Slowly and consistently. Again, this is the kind of thing that if they... Like, a TV animation production might have just animated that shoulder piece as a bit of 3D. Like, they might have just done a 3D model and overlaid it on top of the 2D character, because really rigid objects like this are actually distressingly difficult to animate properly in 3D. On 101 Dalmatians, Disney themselves, like, Cruella de Vil has this fantastic car in that movie, right? What they did in order to get that car animated in the movie is they built a physical model of the car and they started photographing it as much as possible, trying to use rotoscoping so that they wouldn't have to animate the goddamn car by hand, because it's a mechanical object. It has a very specific physicality where if the thing doesn't have exactly the same dimensions from frame to frame, you can tell that something got fucked up. You can tell that something looks wrong. And I can see minor imperfections here. Like, if you take a look at... Let's zoom in really close. Take a look at this shoulder piece right here. You can see how the lines on it shift around just a little bit. Like the thickness here changes just a little bit as he moves more into position, which is one of those small flaws and imperfections that make these, like, really solid objects so distressingly difficult to animate properly. Oh, here's a good demonstration. Take a look at this line right here. Yasuo's cloak is going to whip in front of it, take a look at what happens after. It's moved to a different position. It's not quite consistent. It's a little bit more concave than it was. And that's the kind of thing that makes, like, animating mechanical things and, like, solid metal objects really fucking difficult in hand animation, because you're essentially doing 3D animation by hand. Because you can't, like, with character models, with characters, you can deform them, you can twist them, you can squash them, you can stretch them, you can do all kinds of things to the characters. But with rigid metal objects, with rigid objects in general, stone, wood, all that kind of thing, it kind of has to be perfect from frame to frame, and that's a really fucking difficult thing to do. So a lot of productions will, like, anytime they can get away with it, they will do 3D objects and they'll either rotoscope over top of it or just insert the 3D directly into the scene. A lot of anime has been doing that recently. Because it's just, like, it's so much less work than trying to... And also, like, look at the shoulder piece over here. Like, that little motion. Okay, it's up here. Let's zoom in again, because it's so good. Shoulder piece, right? Look how it's being rotated in space. So you have these 1, 2, 3, 4 major pieces and these 2 minor shoulder pieces, right? They're all being rotated relative to each other. So, like, this shoulder piece is going to practically disappear as it gets rotated out of view, like that. And managing all of that, and you can see the lines boiling and shifting a little bit from frame to frame if you pay attention. Like, it's not quite perfect, but it's so close to perfect that it's they go so hard! Like, it's staggering! They didn't need to. This wasn't necessary, but they did it anyway. I love this so much. So much hard work. So much effort, so much understanding of anatomy and motion. Look at Yasuo's hand. Like, again, let's just zoom in on a tiny detail and gush over it for a second. Look at Yasuo's hand here. Do you see that? Like, a hand is a really fucking complex 3-dimensional object. Like, it's really complicated. It has 5 fingers. It's made up mostly of bones with, like, flesh vaguely strapped over it. It has bulges. It has pits. It has valleys. And they make it look so effortless. How he, like, dips his hand down, rotates it around its own axis, and then brings it up to grasp the blade behind the other arm, the other hand, which is slowly being rotated into, like out of the frame, around its own axis, on the opposite axis, on the horizontal axis, being rotated around the elbow, while they're also managing to keep the hilt of the sword and the sword itself 3-dimensionally consistent from frame to frame. Like, it's so hard! It's difficult! I've tried to do these things myself. Like, once upon a time, I was training to be an animator. I didn't get very far in it, because it's hard! It's really hard! Oh, God. Oh, I could gush about this for a week, but unfortunately we've already got an hour and 20 minutes to get through a minute of this thing. So, okay, let's try and move on. Again, look at Yone's clothes. Like, look at his kimono thing, whatever. Look at how that whips around in the wind as he slowly steps forward. And then that sudden, like, he drops down his hips and you can see he's about to do another one of those dashes. And Yasuo, and again, they're moving the camera in 3D space here. Like, look how they're, like, pull the camera out. And the camera's rotating around the brothers as they fight while they're trying to animate everything else on top of the guy. Insane! This is madness. Like, this is maddeningly good. And again, the same effect. You can see as Yasuo charges up with wind power for his blade, you can see how it just deforms the very air around him. And you can see that, like, the wind basically billowing out of him as he charges around. And oh, look at that sword swipe. Like, look at it's so, he's charging through the winds. He's charging through the air so fast that he's picking up water. Like, the air, he's colliding with so many raindrops that he's basically becoming soaked. And as he swipes in to slash down on his brother, he brings, like, a bucket of water with him. Splash! Oh my god. If I use Twitch lingo, I would say poggers right about now. I would have said poggers a lot. Here's another flex. This is just showing off. This is just bragging. Like, this just basically what this is. Extremely distorted field of view. Basically, they're emulating the effects of a camera lens. If it had... where I need to get my camera terminology right. I'm probably going to get it wrong. But there's camera lenses with the focal length, where you can vary the focal length of the camera in order to manipulate exactly how it presents the various things that it sees. And what they're doing here is they're emulating visually a certain focal length of an actual physical video camera, which of course doesn't exist because these are 2D drawings that someone had to sit down and make on a flat plane. There is no three-dimensional camera. There is no three-dimensional space to distort, but they're emulating it for greater impact, which is why Yasuo's sword looks like 14 miles long in this shot. As you can see the wind power boiling the whole blade again and swinging around. It's like, oh my fucking god, look at this. Like... And again, like, okay, so under normal circumstances, in an animated short, like, this would have been... We talked about this with the Spirit Blossom Yone short thing. That, like, for most of the short, they're not spending much of their animation budget on anything. Because, like, it's relatively downplayed, it's simple motion, they're not doing a bunch of unnecessary flourishes until they get to the big fight scene where Yone fights the demon. And then they go a blowout, like, then they just fucking flip things around. Then they spend all of their animation budget in one go. But the thing is, like, by the time we get to this climactic conflict where, like, the camera starts whipping around and, like, Yone is, like, doing this little walk and it's like, the wind power, blah, yeah, blah. By the time we get to all of this shit, we've already had all of this like, they've already gone hard for, like, a full minute. They've already been bragging and bragging and bragging, and they're like, no, we can still take it up a notch. Take a look at this fucking shit.
I will not fail you again.
It's bragging. It's bragging. That's all it is. It's bragging. And it's fucking amazing. I love it so much. Holy shit. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the animation. As Yone charges in here, Yasuo gets to the other side of him. We get this, like, where Yone is pushing down with two blades, and then Yasuo finds his footing, pushes back, swipes away, then he gets the sword into position, and then he goes from this position and he does this stab forward. Oh, small animation mistake there. Look over on the right side, a little bit of a black bar as the camera is trying to pan, but it has nowhere to pan to. It doesn't matter. Again, it's one of those small animation mistakes that are completely irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. And then we get this, as, like, he does the stab, finds his footing, then he pushes up and goes into a spin. And they just animate the spin. They just do that, and not only do they animate the spin, not only do they rotate the character in 3D space, they do it, like, it's a fairly limited frame time. You can see it looks a little bit jagged at this particular speed. But, like, again, with the fucking complicated mother frickin' shoulder piece goddamn... Look at that! Like, keeping it completely consistent, and then they have the gall, they have the temerity, the sheer arrogance to also animate water effects of water sliding down and being whipped around on the shoulder piece as he rotates around. These bastards, like, this is just bragging. This is just, like, this is unseemly, frankly. And again, with, like, the fiery animation on Yasuo's hair there. Slash, and pushing him back. Like, and then this bragging bullshit, like, it's that boiling on the lines, man. That also takes a ton of work. And then Yasuo, like, curling around, like, it's that motion that gets me. It's the S curve, right? He enters the frame from the right with his, like, gorgeously chiseled physique. Goes into the left of the frame, and as we see him enter into the left side of the frame, you can see that he's got the sword down. And you can see this power charging up around him. And then we get this tension and release thing, once again. Tension. Release. Woof. All of a sudden, he's moving quickly. Like, he spends all of this time over on the left side of the screen like that, just like, hanging out, just waiting for his power to charge up, and then once it's charged, zoom, zoom, wham! And then again, we get this moment of tension and release, like where he zooms around, you get these lovely trailing effects, really outlining exactly where his motion is going, and then once he's just about to strike, we get this moment of quiet, like this moment of building up of tension, and then boom, release of tension as he clashes with his brother. And the visual storytelling here, like just the sheer filmmaking is really, really good, because as they enter, they're both like mostly equal, right? Here they both control, as well, they both occupy about half of the screen. Yone has the right half, Yasuo has the left half. Then they clash, and like they're mostly still equal here, but then look, the camera just literally just pans left, but what you get is this sense that Yasuo is pushing forward. Like, they're not moving, the camera's just panning left, giving Yone less and less space in the frame. He's locked in, he's like being mashed literally behind Yasuo's sword with wind power whipping all over him, while Yasuo has all this open space behind him. He dominates the frame as he dominates the fight, which is just extremely effective. Like, it's a very effective way to do the storytelling of, Yone now is in a little bit of trouble here, because Yasuo is about to whip that big thing around and give him a big meaty slap across the face. Why did I phrase it that way? That was a terrible idea. Please don't put that in the comments. And another bit of flexing. Like, again, I told you how they're basically mimicking the focal length of a camera here. When you do that, when you have these objects that are highly distorted, that don't look natural at all, but look like they're being distorted by a camera lens, animating that correctly, like animating the scale of having the blade be like this massive frickin' thing that just hangs there and occupies like most of the right side of the frame, into being something that like looks like it's being receded as Yasuo moves into the frame. And they're doing the same thing with Yone. Like, they have the same little brag with Yone here with the extreme foreshortening on his sword, and managing that correctly, like managing the size of this highly distorted object correctly, is also a really difficult thing to do. Like, it takes a lot of skill and know-how to make sure that that looks correct, that it looks proper. Again, build-up of tension and release. As the brothers charge towards each other, we get build up, build up, build up, build up, build up, build up, and then release as Yasuo actually kills him. Okay. That was the first minute and 29 of this 10-minute animation. And it took me an hour and a half. I was originally planning just to split this thing into 2. But, yeah, it might be 3 now. It might be a little more than that. That was the first part, anyway. I'll edit it down. It's probably going to be a little bit less than an hour and a half by the time you see it, but by the time I'm done recording it, it's been an hour and a half, and I need a sip of tea. So, if you've enjoyed me just getting angry somehow at this thing being very good, then hit the like, comment, and those subscribe buttons down below, because those buttons make the numbers on YouTube go up, and, like, quite frankly, YouTube cares a lot more about how many people like or dislike a video and how many people comment on it than they care about views. So, like, even if this thing got 100,000 views, which is not gonna, but if it got 100,000 views, that wouldn't be nearly as valuable as if it had gotten, like, a few thousand likes instead. So if you want to help YouTubers out, generally speaking, like, leaving those likes and comments, maybe hitting the bell icon and subscribing and all this stuff, it actually does make kind of a big difference for us. That's why we keep asking you to do it. So if you want to help me out, or other YouTubers that you follow, please do those things. I have a Patreon, I have a merchandise store, I have a tip jar. If you want to support the nonsense that I do more directly, then all 3 of those are equally valid options if you want them, and if not, that's completely okay as well. I do try to encourage people, though, at the end of my videos, to, if they have online content that they enjoy, consider supporting it directly whenever you can with whatever you can, whether that's tips or subscribing to Patreons or buying merchandise, whatever it is, because those little $1 or $2 donations, or that little $3 that you get for selling a shirt on Redbubble or whatever, it's not really much that you get out of it, even though they cost a lot more than that. It means literally the same. It makes the same amount of money as thousands and thousands of ad views on a video. So if there's online content that you enjoy, especially smaller and niche content creators, please consider supporting them directly with anything you can, whenever you can, because you make much more of a difference than it feels like. If you don't want to spend money on, like, talky YouTube men who get too excited about swords, then I also have a link down in the top of my description to some charities that could really use some help right now because of, the pandemic and the police killing people in the United States. Lots of things going on. Yeah. What else? Right, self-promotion. I need to do more of that. I have a second channel. I play video games over there. I play some Legends of Runeterra sometimes. The Final Fantasy games, we're almost done with Final Fantasy 9. We're going to start in on Final Fantasy 10. I try to do, like, character character analysis and story analysis and all the other stuff I do on this channel. I try to do that, but in more of a Let's Play format over there. We're also playing Monster Hunter World and The World Ends With You, another game that's full of anime bullshit in case you're interested in that kind of thing. Yes, like, comment, subscribe to that thing as well. I think that's all I have to say. I need some tea. Thank you very much for watching. Please remember to wash your hands.